So how are you today? How are you enduring quarantine palooza?
I'm doing COVID well. It's all on a separate scale, but on that scale, doing pretty good right now.
Excellent. You still at the stage where you know what day it is? I'm losing track of that.
I'm enjoying it. What I have reason to believe is a lovely Sunday here in Portland. It is a perfect medium gray outside,
Mhm.
and I'm told it's very nice out there. Maybe I'll see it someday.
Of course, it's Saturday, but
Oh, really?
yeah,
Shit. Okay.
we're a
Ah,
family-friendly store. I should mention, which means I'm
oh,
not allowed to swear. So you
okay. Good
you
to
do
know.
as thou wilt. But
Yeah.
um, so welcome to our
Okay.
virtual free comic book day, aka my uncle has a barn. Let's put the show on right here.
That's great.
Um, we've been talking to various writers and artists, and I was streaming them today. So thank you for participating. We really appreciate it. It should come as no surprise to anyone who knows me or to you that I've been a big fan of your work for a long time and have had the privilege of working with you a handful of times. And I can say in all sincerity to anyone who is interested, Steve is possibly the easiest guy to write for and get amazing artwork out the other end. He's ridiculously talented and offsets that by being one of the nicest people in comics and very generous with your time and mentoring up and coming and novice creators. So I want to talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely.
You will frequently post on Twitter extremely useful tutorials on how to survive conventions and how to approach editors and how to construct a page and you often accompany them with actual illustrations. So that's a fair investment of your time and energy for complete strangers who you are broadcasting this out to into the ether. Where did your concept of mentorship in that form come from? Like who taught you that?
That, I guess just a handful of really good teachers. It started, or it, I started wanting to do it because I initially felt a huge absence of it in my life. I grew up in a family that didn't really have much interaction with the arts in any way. Weren't a bunch of big readers, um, and uh, and I felt like there was this important thing, and I wanted to know more about it, and I just had nowhere to go and nowhere to look, nowhere to learn more. My local library, uh, their their comics, books, strips, etc. section had, I think, 5 titles in the entire library, and 3 of them were just Doonesbury reprint books. So there wasn't a whole lot of resources available. I had heard that old comic strips were good, so my way of learning about them was to get um, get old editions of the Pittsburgh Press on microfilm and just read newspapers from World War II, zipping through to the comics page. So I was hungry for information, and then eventually I started finding people who were willing to share some. Um, I had an art teacher in high school who knew some stuff and had some strong opinions, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from listening to him. He had no interest or interaction with comics at all, so I wasn't able to get any of that from him. But just some ideas about aesthetics and drawing. Um, and then I went to Penn State as a business student, which is its own story. But while I was there, I met a couple of art teachers who cared and who were willing to share information. Um, but then when I went to the Joe Kubert School, um, I met a bunch of teachers who were focused on the exact stuff that I wanted to do and had done it for 20, 30, 40 years. And I learned so much from them just sitting there and talking to me, um, acknowledging that sometimes you're solving these things on the level of an artist, and sometimes you're just solving them on the level of a technician or a craftsman, and you have to juggle both. And the difference that talking to those folks made in my life was enormous, and knowing that maybe I could do something similar for somebody else it was a no-brainer. I had no choice but to do it.
So, what's the one piece of advice that you've given that you wish you had gotten right out of the gate? Like, what was the thing you really wish someone had told you?
Oh man. Well, they did tell me. I just didn't listen.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
And that was about taking deadlines seriously. When I started, I was very good with deadlines, but I had a stretch of a couple of years where I let that get away from me, and it hurt me, and it hurt my collaborators, and it hurt my career. I got back on the track, and now deadlines are vitally important to me. But the most important advice I got, just overall, was the basis of how to build a career. And the specifics always change. When I was coming up, it was it was all about making Xeroxes and putting them in manila envelopes and mailing them to people, and that's no longer really a thing. But there's 3 principles to getting hired in any kind of commercial field. Number 1, do good work. That's the base right there. Do good stuff. Number 2, be prolific. Do a lot of it. And number 3, put it in front of as many eyeballs as you possibly can. And the way you're going to get in front of those eyeballs, that's changing all the time. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was talking to artists, and one of their best ways of getting work was via MySpace. I'm told that's not such a useful venue anymore. The channels by which you get your stuff out there are changing constantly. But the principle is the same. Get that work in front of people's eyeballs, in front of people who can hire you, who can pay you to do the work, people who are hungry to see it. And yeah, do good work, do a lot of it, lots of eyeballs. Those 3 principles are universal.
Excellent. What would you say is the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Oh man, find your style.
Okay.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in art school worried that I didn't have a style yet, that I needed to reach out and figure out what my style is. And you can't choose it. You cannot sit down and try to pick a style. What you have to do is draw a lot, draw sincerely, and try to express what it is try to express things with the drawings that mean things to you. And in the end, style will choose you. It's just the result of doing a whole lot of drawing and letting the process express your personality.
That's cool. So going back to rating like old newspaper strips and stuff for your early sort of mentorship, I guess.
Yeah, it was. I had I had all the various cartoonists that the Pittsburgh Press and the Post Gazette had to teach me how this stuff worked.
Who or well, maybe not even so much which creator, but was there a particular strip or creator that stuck out as you that you still see the influence of in your own work?
Milton Caniff.
Okay, because that was going to be my vote.
Yeah, I loved the strip. It was cool. It was gorgeously drawn. It was amazing. I also learned a lot. I don't think you can see the influence at all, but early Dick Tracy stuck with me considerably. That now it's it is what it is. It's what you can get. It's as good as you can possibly get away with in a daily newspaper today with your little 3 postage stamps next to each other. But at the time, it was a blood-drenched gore fest of wild ultraviolence. It was the comic was nuts. The stuff they were getting away with in the Great Depression in newspapers was crazy. It was brutal. It was sadistic, and it moved at this freight train pace, and all drawn in this almost in this kind of scary diagrammatic style that it was the visual equivalent of Jack Webb from Dragnet shouting at you for 4 panels a day.
Surrounded by the cast of Todd Browning's freaks in a lot of
exactly,
cases.
yeah, nothing like it. There's some great reprints of the early stuff. If you could, if anyone watching this can find them, go dig in to read that stuff. Read the Mrs. Pruneface story and see just how weird and brutal a comic strip can be.
So you've had the opportunity to tackle a lot of different kinds of comics, from the kind of gritty, realistic mystery of Whiteout, a murder mystery set in Antarctica, to wacky supervillain hijinks and good plug, wacky supervillain hijinks and superior foes of Spider-Man. We didn't plan this, by the way.
Be prepared, folks.
Yep. To stuff in between, like The Fix, which is kind of wacky non-supervillain hijinks in an otherwise realistic setting. What kind of stuff appeals to you the most? Like, what tickles your fancy? What's your favorite stuff to draw?
I honestly don't have a favorite thing to draw. I've got a few things that are a pain in the butt to draw.
Let's hear those then.
It's never been a big strength of mine keeping settings really, really accurate from panel to panel, drawing things in that Dave Gibbons with Dave Gibbons' architectural precision, so that I can show a scene from 3 different angles, and readers could notice if a lamp moved, if a lamp moved between panel 2 and panel 3. Mm-hmm. If someone had a procedural story that required that kind of precision, I'd be the wrong guy for it.
I should point out that Steve drew an original graphic novel that I co-wrote with Brandon Jerwa that is essentially what he just described. So, so I guess I should take this opportunity to publicly apologize for what was clearly misery. I'm sorry, carry on.
No, carry on. But what I like is a story where I understand why everything's there and what it's for, where characters' choices have consequences, and where important points are made with the pictures. That's a really, really hard thing to get across to new writers when I'm talking to them, is the idea that you want your story to turn on the information in the pictures. That's how you make a comic that's not a radio play with drawings underneath it. I like to be able to use those pictures to kick a reader, to surprise them, to make them to make them feel something that came out of that emerged. I was going to say that came out of nowhere, but not that came out of nowhere, but that emerged from the information we gave them before. A big part of what I love about comics is the magic of laying one panel next to another panel, next to another panel, next to another panel. There's that alchemy where you give a reader one piece of information and then give them another piece of information, and then they do the synthesis to create the third thing. It's thrilling, and I love it when it's used to deliver a laugh. I love it when it's used to deliver tragedy. When it's used to scare. It's just really thrilling to me. Going back to stuff I'm not as into, I'm generally much less into stories that rely on pictures just for the beauty of what's in the picture. There's not trashing that at all. There's artists who are magnificent at it. But if the point of a moment is, doesn't so and so look cool? Don't they look gorgeous? Don't they look awesome? Don't they look scary? Doesn't interest me as much. I like it when the pictures are communicating narrative, not just communicating sensation.
That makes sense. So let's dig in on that a little bit. What's the project what's your passion project? What's the one that you haven't had the chance to do yet that you're dying to do?
Oh man.
Like put aside any commercial considerations. Like if you could
Sure.
just purely do the thing, what is the thing?
Well, I've wanted to do a. This is so dry and dull. It's one of those things that no one will. Yeah, but it really interests me, and I think I can make it good. Some folks who know me may know that I'm a non-driver, and I've got a long history of disliking cars and wanting them off the road, etc. And I'd love to do a documentary comic about the problems with cars and what they've done to the country. And no one wants to read this. No one wants to hear it.
We'll talk offline.
Yeah,
I may have an angle for you.
Very cool.
All right. So a lot of the folks we've talked to, kind of one of our default questions is, what's the comic that really hooked you early on? But it seems you came to it. Oh, you have an answer. Okay, cool. Because you came to it through newspaper strips. So,
that was the newspaper strips were once I was already hooked on comics. I still own the very first comic that I ever owned. It was a Submariner comic drawn by Maurice Severin and Johnny Craig in 1969, 2 years after I was born.
Wow.
My dad would every once in a while go to these weird, scary hole-in-the-wall stores in the next town over from Pittsburgh, and this. I got to go to these stores eventually myself, and they only sold books and magazines that were supposed to have been destroyed.
Right. Okay.
So in the old days when comics were sold on the newsstand, if a comic didn't sell, they could be returned. But rather than pay to ship the whole comic, they would just rip the cover off and mail the cover back, and they were supposed to just junk the rest of the comic. Rather than doing that, they'd box them up and sell them to these job lot stores that would then sell like 3 coverless comics for $0.25 or 12 for $1 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that was the only way I was allowed to buy comics, because comics were at the time 35 cents each, and I would have taken a hell of a beating if I had actually spent 35 cents on a single comic book. But for at a dime a piece or 12 for $1, my dad would go and get me just a stack of comics that he would pick at random. The first one of these I got was this Submariner comic, and I read it over and over and over again. It was cool and mysterious. It was a Roy Thomas story where the villain had this nobility, and I'd never seen anything like that in any kind of thing on TV before. I was a little confused because Submariner looked like buff Mr. Spock in Speedos. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't figure out why the guy from Star Trek was just running around in a bathing suit. Nonetheless, yeah. I thought it was really cool. And I still have the comic, and at some point when I was 5 or 6, I went through the comic and I re-inked every single figure with a ballpoint. So I was training myself on how to draw comics at the age of 5.
Wow.
Yeah, and
so you still have that same copy. You didn't go get like a nostalgia copy.
I have the exact same copy, and it has that kind of barrel of rotting fruit smell that only the oldest comics have.
There was always something magical about those strip cover comics. My big immersion into comics was that we were moving from one town to another town, and because we were building a home. I was just leaving 7th grade. It was supposed to be done by the time 8th grade started, and the contractors were awful, and we didn't have walls or a roof or anything by the time school started. So I was living with my grandparents, who were in that town that we were moving to, so I wouldn't have to switch schools mid-year. While my poor parents spent almost a year living in crappy motels.
Wow.
My dad was a pharmacist, and he worked for a retail pharmacy chain, which meant they had a newsstand, which meant newsstand distributors, which meant strip cover comics. And I was miserable and living in a town where I didn't know anybody. And like my grandparents, my grandmother in particular were, lovely people, but hanging out with senior citizens when you're going into 8th grade, it was pretty lonely and miserable.
Wow.
I'm sorry, going into 7th grade. It was my 7th grade year. And one guy who worked for my dad had been saving strip cover comics, had to be 30 years. He had a refrigerator box full of them and a washing machine box full of them. And so that summer, it was, you can borrow these. And I read every single one. And I think the most recent comic in there was from like 1974. And it was Marvel and DC and superhero stuff. But it was old Westerns and old romance comics and Charlton stuff, like all the weird Ditko, like Mr. E stuff was in there. And it was just like the entire DNA of Western comics was in that box. And I didn't know what any of it was because nothing had a cover. Like, you had to kind of do the archaeology of it and figure it out. And that's where I learned to actually read the indicia. I figured out, there's these little words here that tell me what the book is. Like, who does that at that age, right? But it was like, and I've never forgotten some of that stuff. Oh, and what was the other weird one? It was like a gold key one, like E-Man.
Yeah.
It was just,
I love those.
Yeah. The weird offbeat stuff was just a huge thing for me, which is probably why Dan DiDio used to shake his head and sob a little every time I'd say, I've got a really good take on Ultra the Multi-Alien. You should let me do it. I miss that.
I wonder how many folks of our era have an origin story like that. Because a big part of getting books like that is you didn't get, if you weren't picking it up month to month on the newsstand and the comic was to be continued, you never got to see what happened. Mm-hmm. So you'd get part 1 and not have part 2, or you'd have part 2 but with no idea what happened in part 1.
So did you have a traumatic one like that?
Did you everything. I had no 2 continuous comics anywhere in my collection, until I was like 16. And what that meant was I spent a lot of time thinking about what might have happened.
Yep. That was great.
Yeah, which has to be early training for how to do this stuff.
Yeah, I know it. I had notebooks filled with that stuff. Didn't ever do my homework assignments. It drove my parents nuts because all you care about is all this silly comic book stuff. But then, of course, it became my life, right? But the most traumatic one for me was an issue of Star Wars, oddly. And it was during the Empire Strikes Back era. So it was Archie Goodwin writing it, and it was Walt Simonson and Tom Palmer inking it. So they were gorgeous books, right? They were unassailably gorgeous. Comic. And it was one where Lando had to go back to Cloud City, where the Ugnaughts, when he gets there, he finds it deserted, and the Ugnaughts have staged a labor riot because of the Empire's unfair practices, and have planted bombs all through Cloud City, and made them out of droid parts. So the bombs all talk. And it was really fun and funny and inventive and crazy. And at the end of it, because Lando has had to form a temporary truce with the Imperials who've taken over Cloud City, the Imperial naturally double crosses him and kicks him over the edge of Cloud City, and he's falling towards Bespin Below. To be continued. And I had every issue of that Star Wars run in the era it came out, except for 1 month, and it was the one where that resolved that story. And I had a complete collection for years and years and years, and it was a good decade after that before I finally found that issue. I was actually working on Star Wars product at the time, and I could write to my rep at Lucasfilm and go, I need a photocopy of this issue. And they sent it to me, and it was dreadful. Good. It was so bad. I should have totally never read that issue. It was terrible.
Whatever you came up with in your head was better, yeah.
Yeah, Lando falls on a balloon, basically. He falls on a blimp below him, and that was the resolution to it. It's Star Wars, man. Not even a cool spaceship. It's a balloon.
Yeah. One of my big, important early lessons in how comics work was from the combination of Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson. I had the Marvel Treasury Edition adaptation of or was it was the magazine size adaptation of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. A movie I'd seen a whole bunch of times, so I knew as well as you could know a movie in those days before video cassettes or DVDs. And seeing how two top-notch creators working at the top of their game solved the problem of telling these stories or of translating these filmic scenes to comics was a really, really good lesson. I did a Twitter thread recently where I shouted out to that, and I found a sequence in that Close Encounters adaptation that I unconsciously swiped 20 years later for Whiteout. It was shocking to me to see. Oh my God! I didn't have the comic in front of me or anything, but it imprinted on me so much that 20 years later, Greg gave me a sequence in Whiteout, and the very best solution that my brain came up with was lifted right from Walt Simonson.
What was the Whiteout scene, if I can ask?
Oh, I can. Hold on, I've got the book in front of me. I can pull it up.
While you're doing that,
it was just good.
I was going to say, a couple of years ago, one of the last conventions I did was the Spokane Comic Con. We've done once before. And it was after they had moved, and their dealer's room, a guy had a stack of those Close Encounters. He had to have 50 of them, and they all had a hole punch all the way through the upper right corner. I bought as many of them as I could. They were like $1 a piece, and gave them out as Christmas gifts that year. It's such a good book.
That's cool.
What do you got?
Here's the bottom 3 panels here.
The
fade to white. And if you put my name and Close Encounters into your Twitter search box, you can see the side-by-side comparison.
Yeah, I can see it now. It never would have occurred to me, but because I had absorbed that same book. Well, there's an interesting question. We're talking about adaptation and stuff. Have you ever had to do a kind of like movie tie-in or TV tie-in like that? And what was that like?
I've never had to do an adaptation. I've done some spin-off products, some things. I've done some video game things that are under NDA that were done anonymously. And I did I did a Star Trek story back around 2000 where we killed McCoy. I've had a bunch of people who work in the Trek world who told me that as far as they're concerned, it was canon, which was very, very flattering.
Nice.
It was just
I'm dead, Jim.
just this lovely, sad 8 or 10 page story that Wildstorm printed. Someone someone scanned and put the entire thing up on Tumblr, and I retumbled it recently. I'll put that URL up.
Join us for flashcards with Steve.
Yeah. I think I'm just Steve Lieber at stevelieber.tumblr.com. I don't even know my proper URL.
How dare you, sir?
Yeah.
We come to you with such preparation.
Yeah, I'm looking down here because I'm writing with a magic marker real quick. I'm spelling Tumblr wrong. That's how much I use my Tumblr account.
Well, you don't have a TikTok yet?
Meep. Boy.
Right. Got it.
I would have a TikTok, just because, like I said, use whatever is available. But no one wants to see me no one wants to see me doing repeated backwards dances or whatever the hell it is you're supposed to do on TikTok. Words, absolutely, but no. If you're listening to my voice, you hear that I sound like Conan the Frog thanking everyone for coming to his bar mitzvah.
So let's talk about your standard work day. You walk into the studio. What happens? Just tell us about your studio and your process, like how you approach the day.
I'm part of Helioscope, which is a studio of at this point 25, maybe 30. I don't even know the exact number. working comic book professionals in Portland, Oregon. On any given day, there's 13 or 14 people. I'm usually the second person in the room. If there wasn't a pandemic going on, I would go in. Probably Dylan McConis would be in there with her shaggy little mop dog, and I go in and like every other comics pro, I spend 10% of my workday just answering email.
Only 10%? Wow.
Yeah,
That's efficient.
yeah. I'm able to save a lot of time and do it really, really efficiently by not worrying at all about grammar or spelling. My emails are atrocious. Once it's that, I fire up my 2007 Cintiq, running on a Macintosh that I think is from 2008. Uh, my equipment is ancient, and I'm worried that someday I'll need to replace it. But so far so good. Uh, it it's uh, it's like a car from the 70s that I've just been repairing by going to the dump and finding parts. Um, and I'll have my whole Cintiq, my big Cintiq screen in front of me, the script taking up part of the window, the drawing program taking up the other part of the window, any reference I've shot in little windows or bits surrounding what I need to draw, and I I I always have. I'm terrified by that blank white page, so I immediately try to get something down. Usually, the first thing I put down is just lettering. Um, I'll block out where the lettering should go, just so I can see how much space it is I need to fill, and how much space I have to work with. Um, that's always been an important part of my process. Now that I'm doing a lot of humor stuff, it's even more important because where I put the lettering in a panel, it affects the timing of the jokes. I've tested it out, and it's like, oh, okay, God, if the balloon is up here, the joke's not funny. If the balloon's down here, it is, and I have no idea why that is, but I have to do all that stuff. So block the lettering down, and then I'll just scribble something in there, just something, so that I'm not facing that terrifying white void of an empty panel. Um, I frequently, especially if a scene is a talkie scene, I'll shoot a lot of photo reference, and that sometimes means forcing my studio mates to step up from their drawing table and come in and act things out or make embarrassing faces. I've got hard drives full of great blackmail material for a number of prominent Portland cartoonists. Just making ridiculous faces, pointing plastic weapons at the camera, doing embarrassing things. But that stuff makes a big difference for me. It's funny. I avoided using photo reference for years, probably the first decade of my career. I would only use photo reference for getting stuff right. Okay, where are the flaps on this sort of airplane? What does the windshield look like on this model of car? That kind of thing. But almost never for people. And at some point, I realized Norman Rockwell spent his entire career tracing photos. Neil Adams bragged that he wouldn't draw a toaster without photographing it and tracing the photo.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of Al Williamson shot photos for almost every panel that he drew. And if these people who could draw circles around me thought it was useful and necessary to incorporate photo reference into what they did, who the hell am I to avoid it? And as soon as I did that, my work got better and I got faster. the small deadline problems that I mentioned at the start of the conversation went away, and it helped me get over a plateau. It's really interesting. I had I had gotten to a certain level of quality, and then my stuff just kind of stayed there for a long time. And what I found was, if I have to draw somebody sitting in a chair, there's only three or four ways that coming up that just thinking it up that I would draw a person sitting in a chair. But when I would ask my studio mates, okay, you're sitting in a chair and you've got the advantage in the conversation and you're waiting to see if your opponent makes a mistake. And they would give me all these great poses, and they'd lean in, they'd put their hands back, they'd shift their weight slightly, they'd put one hand up on the armrest, and I was getting poses that I would never in a million years have come up with. And a funny thing about working with photos, there's a lot of information in any photo that an artist has in front of him. Some of that information will make your drawing better. A lot of that information will make your drawing much, much worse. And it's your job as an artist to gather all the good stuff and throw away all the bad stuff. And that became a big part of my process. Now, I've gotten way off field for you asking me how my day starts in the studio.
Hey man, we got an hour to fill, so.
Oh, this is good. This is good.
So you had mentioned the script, that you'd have the script up in part of the window. Many of our viewers / listeners are probably unaware of that. There's a couple of different ways to write scripts. I prefer, as a writer, writing a full script because it helps me figure out where my pace is. And I'll include a lot. You've been victim of one of my scripts, so I'll have a lot of visual information built into every script. Like, here's the scene you're in, and the idea there is to give you, the artist, here's the landscape. You pick the parts and camera angles that work best to achieve what I'm going for here. And I'm less concerned about you jamming all of this information into the panel. I just don't want it contradicted. That was because I was a casualty early on. My first comic was a video game tie-in, and a studio had been hired, and it was very much a studio. I think they were out of Pennsylvania. They wouldn't put anything in the panel that wasn't in the script. And if, in the case of it being a video game tie-in, there's a particular weapon that was used in this game that the character had been armed with, but I wanted it with a silencer because there's a shooting in a hospital, and it needs to be covert, or else security is going to show up. That's a story impact to a gunshot going off in a hospital. But because the model in the game didn't have a silencer, they wouldn't just draw the can on the end of it. So I ended up having to rewrite the entire first issue because it just wouldn't draw it without that. So I tend to be very militant about, it'll say, panel 1 and a description of the panel, and then all the dialogue and sound effects, and panel 2, and I'll often include thumbnails about where I want the emphasis placed. So this panel's bigger, this one's smaller. But then there's also plot style or Marvel style, wherein the writer will send you a much shorter abbreviated version of what the story is, and it's up to you to figure out, as the artist, where everything goes, and then often they'll throw the dialogue on after it's drawn. And there's a couple other hybrid versions of all of that. So when you're mentioning a script, do you have a preferred script style to work with? Do you prefer full script? Do you prefer plot style? Do you prefer something else?
I actually like a mix. I enjoy working with both, so I'm happy to get scripts that occasionally give me a chance to be Robin Williams and just improvise on the page, especially with comedy. But honestly, I'm happy with either one, so long as everything that's there is there for a reason, and so long as the overall story works. I'm very happy getting a chance to be more of a writer with the pictures. You and I have discussed earlier, I've had scripts that say page 14 through 17, they fight. And so then getting to actually try to write with pictures and come up with shtick and interesting bits, and not just have two characters fighting, but to actually come up with ways that they fight that reveal character. Or in another example that I've talked about a lot, it was me. I had a script thing that said for this page, quote, maybe something funny happens with so and so. And that was
insert joke here.
Yeah. And so I wrote a 1-page silent gag and put that in, and that was a blast. I've also had the pleasure of working with really tight scripts where everything was solved. Your scripts, Greg's scripts, especially Matt Fraction scripts on Jimmy Olsen are incredibly tight. Yeah, and Matt does what most writers should not do, in that he will call camera angles, but he does it very well, he's visualizing a joke, and it's just up to me to execute it. But it's a well constructed joke, and I'm happy to do it. When I work with Jeff Parker, as often as not, he includes thumbnail layouts for the page, because Jeff, in addition to being a terrific writer, is also a very accomplished comics artist. And I'm free to discard them, but Jeff writes so visually that what he's coming up with, the best solution is also what he doodled. It's wild and maddening to me, because his layouts are so crisp and so well done that I feel like you could like with you put in an hour of polishing on his thumbnails and you'd have the story right there. You could run that, but he likes working with other artists. Yeah, there's so many different ways to make comics, and I'm happy to do them all. As I mentioned, I'm very story focused. So all that matters to me is what the reader takes away from it. How we get there, that's just the behind the scenes thing that the reader shouldn't worry themselves about at all.
That's excellent. So let's shift gears a little bit here. Are you a reader of comics for pleasure as well, or has it become like the hobby that became the job? I'm curious.
I rarely read the kind of stuff that I make, but I've I still love a good comic, especially if it has a voice that's distinct and its own. What I like most about comics is their ability to let me see the world through somebody else's eyeballs for a little bit. I've got some recent comics I enjoyed right here. More visual aid stuff. Yes.
Steve Lieber, the most prepared man in comics. I love it.
This is a terrific heist story from TKO Comics. Came out, yeah. Roxanne Gay and Ming Doyle just kicking butt on here. Lovely comic.
Jordy Belair in there too, I see. Yep. Yeah, that's not a bad team.
No.
that ain't slouchy.
Yeah. Speak. This was a graphic novel adaptation of a classic YA novel. I'm not sure how much involvement the original author Laurie Halls Anderson had on the adaptation. The adaptation is drawn by, and I think written by, I'm not quite sure how they worked, by Emily Carroll, who's a video game artist who also done some really nifty stuff. She did a bunch of kind of children's book horror comics that received a lot of attention a few years ago when she put them online, and has been involved in a bunch of other things. But it is a great adaptation, a heck of a comic. My constant lifelong favorite, and maybe the biggest influence on my work in Superior Foes of Spider-Man and The Fix. Little Lulu. These things. the guy who did these, John Stanley, is a damn genius. Unbelievably great storyteller, and the stuff is as fresh and weird and surreal and funny. Uh, this is gold right here, and
it's fascinating to me how many artists that we've talked to for this cite Little Lulu, it's not just like the folks who do comedic material, right? It's the horror guys, and the horror guys in particular seem to be like, oh, Little Lulu was great. Like that, it's something interesting to me about that.
He's just this elementally gifted craftsman. He knows exactly how to put gags together. He's got things to say. He's funny. The drawing's wonderful. Actually, John Stanley also did some of the best horror comics ever done. Google John Stanley and horror, and you'll see some really weird, creepy, surreal comics he did in the 50s. It was around the same time as the EC guys, but the tone and the vibe was very different. He's like, oh, this is genuinely creepy, scary stuff. You can do everything.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Little Lulus are so beautifully economical too. The line is just so it's very minimal, but the backgrounds are, like he almost had that like watercolor stuff in some of the color inserts where it's just little dabs of color here and there, but that's a house behind her, or like it's the magic you were talking about before. He was definitely the David Copperfield of implied background for sure.
That's very
good. Interesting. All right.
I got more.
Keep going. Tell us what you're reading. What's the one that's the most under the radar, you think? What's the book that you think more people should have read and didn't?
I think this one is pretty far under the radar. This is from Karen Berger's Berger Books imprint, and it's by a prominent science fiction writer, Eddie Okafor. And drawn by Tana Ford and James Devlin. And it's having a tough time keeping this on camera here. And it's good, immersive, near future science fiction, handsomely drawn, and the artist really goes to it. It's a very, very crowded, inhabited world that they're doing, and the artist does the work of doing tons and tons of world building in the pictures. It's a lot of work for an artist. And Ford and Devlin kicked butt on it. It's great. I thought it was a really cool comic. And I didn't see it getting any attention whatsoever. And I hope, I hope that during this time when people are picking up stuff that when there are new things coming out, that folks will go back and pick up that one as one they missed. Another one a lot of people slept in with a lot of visual world building. The Long Con from Oni Press, co-written by my studio mate Dylan McConis and a talented local writer and humorist, Ben Coleman. And it's a sadly relevant concept. Essentially, the apocalypse happened during San Diego Comic-Con. And so everybody at the con.
Times I pray for that at that
show.
Yeah.
And so everyone at the con is trapped there and has to rebuild civilization based upon their lives at the convention. And it's over the top funny, has a lot to say about humanity and popular culture, and great goofy shtick, and tons of background gags and world building, there's 3 times as much work going into every panel as most comics, just because all these gags are all meticulously constructed to tell you something about the imaginary pop culture franchise that they're part of, and it's just fantastic. Another recent comic that I like. This one's getting a lot of attention, but like anything else, not nearly enough. The Hard Tomorrow by the great Eleanor Davis. Davis is, I think, one of the best cartoonists of our era, and this is more near future stuff, and it's sweet and it's sad and a little scary, and Davis is an incredibly emotional artist who keeps her drawing. Her drawing is gorgeous, and she doesn't. She's boy, I'm terrible at describing pictures. It's academically incredibly solid illustration that also has a really, really strong expressionist component to it. Maybe the best way I can describe it. And you go online and you'll be able to find some excerpts. Eleanor Davis, The Hard Tomorrow.
Good recommendation.
Yeah.
So we're getting up on having held you here for almost an hour. So you've served your time bravely and manfully.
My pleasure.
So is there anything that you're working on now or that you have coming up that you want to talk about?
Jimmy Olsen. The 12-issue Jimmy Olsen series that I've been doing with Matt Fraction and Nathan Fairbairn and letterer Clayton Cowles is continuing. The last issue on the stands was issue 9. Issue 10 is somehow coming to comic stores on May 19th. I'm not quite sure what mechanism by which it's going to get to comic stores. I'm told that that things are happening. That's going to restart distribution somehow.
DC has allied with a new distributor, essentially. So it's the opening shot in the Diamond Wars. Welcome back to the 90s. I'm very excited for waiting for Heroes World to relaunch. Who knows what's going to come. Issue 10 will be out May 19th. Issue 11 sometime after that. And I'm currently drawing issue 12. Fantastic.
The big finale. Yeah, I'm having the time of my life on this book.
I have gotten out of reading a lot of superhero and superhero-related books. I dip my toe in for long periods, and then I need to detox a little. But I got to say, Jimmy Olsen is possibly one of my favorite DC books I've read in years. And that was a character, man, you were born to draw. It is so good. So buy early, buy often, listeners.
I feel like I'm repaying a debt that 10-year-old me incurred a long time ago. I adored all those weird Jimmy Olsen stories that DC used to put out. I never understood why they existed, or this is so bizarre. This is so weird.
Why is Superman making Jimmy marry an ape? That was my favorite.
Exactly. Yeah. Why is Jimmy being the Beatles in ancient Rome? But Matt found a way to tell a story in the modern DC universe that incorporates all that strangeness and still has relevancy to today's readers and today's DCU. It's wild.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for participating in our virtual free comic book day. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and great to see you.
It's wonderful. I can't wait to actually see you in person in the after times.
Yeah. Yes. That will be, that's cute. There's a future.
Yeah.
Have a good day, brother. Thank you.
All right, later on, man. Bye-bye.